Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, this is a relatively short video about differential hardening of sword and knife blades, weapon blades, could even be axes as well, actually, thinking about it. Basically, anything with an edge on it, differential hardening. Now, what is that? That is quite simply where the edge is quenched and the rest of the blade is quenched to a lesser degree via various methods, and I'll go a little bit more into detail. Now, the reason I'm making this video is I've been talking to quite a few people recently about Japanese swords, and it's become evident to me that a lot of people who are into Japanese swords, this is a original Kanbun era, so late 17th century, late 1600s, katana, and it's become evident to me that a lot of people who are interested in Japanese swords think that the differential hardening on Japanese swords is unique to Japanese swords, and that's not the case. In fact, a lot of people just generally are aware of the fact that there's this peculiar style of quenching, hardening in other words, the Japanese sword blade, whereby the majority of the blade is covered in a form of clay, a slip essentially, and it's quenched into water. Now, there are two peculiar things about Japanese swords which we need to highlight there. Number one, the fact that they cover some of the blade in material before they quench the entire blade, so therefore you are hardening the whole blade, but you're hardening the edge more, and that's what gives you the characteristic hamon, which is the sort of whiter coloured edge to a Japanese traditionally made sword blade, which is harder than the rest of the blade. So hence the name differential hardening or differential quench, whereby the edge, both by virtue of being thinner, so therefore it cools down quicker, and by virtue of not being covered by clay, cools down a lot quicker. Therefore the edge is a lot harder than the back. Now, that's not to say that the back of a Japanese made blade is entirely soft. Indeed, it is hardened to some extent. Therefore, it's just not hardened as much. If you want to talk about numbers, for example, Rockwell, then typically on a Japanese blade you might get something like 60 Rockwell on the edge and 30 to 40 Rockwell on the back. So it's still harder than the sort of freshly forged unhardened blade at the back, but it's just nowhere near as hard as the edge is. So the two characteristic things and notable things about Japanese blades is that they are water quenched and that they're covered in clay. Now, are other blades ever covered in clay? Well, in the modern world, obviously people can make things in the Japanese style, so they could make a modern Bowie knife, for example, or whatever else, any other kind of bushcraft knife, and you could put hamon on it by covering the blade in clay, but not the edge, quenching it, and you'd have a hamon. And you could do that incidentally in oil or water. Now, generally speaking, that covering the blade with clay is, as far as I'm aware, pretty much special to Japan. So that's one of the characteristic features. Secondly, quenching in water. Now, many other cultures have quenched in water, and I'll talk a bit about those here. So it's not unique to Japan. It must be said, quenching in water, if you've ever watched Forged in Fire, you'll know quenching, they all go, no, don't quench in water. It produces a very hard edge, but potentially very brittle. And in fact, we see that with Japanese blades. They are very hard, but they are more glass-like, they are more brittle. It is easier to chip a Japanese traditionally made edge than it is European 19th century sabre or a medieval European sword, because they are hardened to such a high degree. They're very hard, but very brittle at the edge. And the water quenching is one of the things that facilitates that. Now, other cultures did sometimes quench in water. In fact, it's known that it was done in medieval Europe. And indeed, I know that Nepalese kukris are often quenched with water. And in fact, I believe that some Indian and Middle Eastern blades are sometimes quenched with water, but not always. And certainly in the modern world, with modern steels, which are very different to traditionally forged steels, it is usual to quench with oil because it is more forgiving and you're less likely to get fractures and failures and such like. But you do get slightly less hard at the edge as a result of that, because it essentially cools down the it's to do with specific heat capacity. It cools down the edge at a slightly slower rate, so it's less abrupt, less harsh. Therefore, you end up with a slightly less hard edge, but a slightly less brittle edge. And for most purposes, it's better to have something that's not quite as hard, but certainly more durable, tougher. Okay. Now, So those two things, covering with clay, yes, that is peculiar to Japan. Quenching the water, that is not unique to Japan, although Japan makes a big thing of it and it's not always done everywhere else. Now, Japan isn't the only place, and this is the bit I want to set straight. Japan isn't the only place that used differential hardening or differential quenching. A good example is how a traditional kukri is made. Now, this isn't universal, and there would certainly be lots of modern makers who would heat up the whole blade and quench the whole thing in oil, just like most modern knives are made. However, there are traditional makers who water quench the edge, not the same as the Japanese do it, by covering the back of the blade and submerging the whole thing, but instead by pouring water along the edge. Now, what's interesting is that this requires a certain amount of eye and hand coordination, and what you use, I've seen them actually using a teapot. Anything that pours water will do it, and a teapot pours water quite precisely. And of course, because of the nature of tea production, there were quite a lot of tea pouring vessels available in that part of the world, particularly obviously in India and what was called Ceylon back in the day, now Sri Lanka, but widely available in Nepal as well. So by essentially heating up the blade to your when it stops being magnetic, so your quenching temperature, when it's bright orange glowing, you then pour water along the edge. Now, what's interesting about this is this essentially doesn't quench the back of the blade at all. It leaves the back of the blade completely soft and annealed, and only hardens the edge. So you could say it's an even more drastic version of the Japanese method, where they submerge the whole blade but the back of the blade's covered. In this case, they completely harden the edge with water. Although theoretically you could put oil in the teapot, I suppose, but I think it's usually water. You pour water along the edge and don't quench the back at all, so even more stark. So in that sense, the kukri hardening is even more dramatic in a way than the Japanese hardening. And you could also say less artistic, less precise, because the pouring of the water along the edge won't give such a stark difference that leads to a hamon, and certainly you can't put patterns like you can in the clay. It would simply be there's a hardened region and then there's a slightly less hardened region behind it, and then there's a completely non-hardened region towards the back of the blade. So the Nepalese did it. Additionally, I also know that they did it in India. Perhaps not a surprise, really, considering that the Nepalese probably got some of their technology at least from India, and there was a big sort of migration of technology backwards and forwards between India and all of the neighbouring countries, and Nepal is next to India. So absolutely, you find it on Indian blades. The way that you know that it's been done is when you clean an Indian blade, you will often notice a difference in the colour of the steel. So sometimes you will see that it is a different colour along the edge. So you can see that there's a difference between the hardening that's carried out on the edge and the rest of the blade. I myself on camera have done restoration on a Wootz blade, and that Wootz blade, indeed, you can see it is a different colour at the front to the back. That's not because we know it's Wootz, so it's crucible steel, it's one homogeneous piece of steel. But we know that therefore that must come from the heat treatment. So it was differentially hardened, it's got a hardened edge. Additionally, I have encountered a lot of bent tulwar blades in the past, and I have straightened them in some cases, not all, but in some cases I've straightened them, and a lot of tulwars are soft at the back, but they nevertheless have a very hard edge, which shows me they have been differentially hardened by some method, and there's no evidence that I'm aware of that they ever covered the blade with clay as they do in Japan. Now we move to a somewhat different area, move to Indonesia now with the Perang Nabur, and again we see evidence of edge hardening on these. You would equally see it with certain Filipino, Vietnamese, Thai, all sorts of Southeast Asian knives and swords. You find evidence for differential hardening. In fact, if we skip over to Europe, I don't actually have any examples to show you, but if we go to medieval European swords, generally speaking, they were through hardened and spring tempered. But if we look at eating knives, there is quite a bit of evidence that there was differential hardening on eating knives and axes in many cases, and warhammers perhaps as well, where they would quench the edge or the point, but they wouldn't necessarily quench the whole rest of the item. That has the advantage of you've got the hardness located at the piercing tip or cutting edge, and of course you've got a lot of toughness and sort of shock absorption behind it, which is a good combination. Possibly they did that with arrowheads as well, and spearheads and other things. More research needs to be done on that. Now if we skip over to China. So here is it's a replica, in this case from LK Chen, but a lot has said about differential hardening on Chinese blades, and there is quite a bit of evidence that it was done in China as well, which shouldn't be so much of a surprise given that they were doing it as standard in Japan, and a lot of technology in Japan came from China. But that being said, there's a growing amount of evidence that certain technology actually flowed back the other way as well, and certain things to do with sword designs, which I'll look at in future videos, where actually the Japanese were the innovators and the Chinese copied. So it went both directions. And with China, it's true of other areas as well. They sometimes took inspiration from areas like Korea, or in some cases the Mongols or Europe. So yes, indeed, these kind of flows of development and information go backwards and forwards. So I think that's all I need to say on the subject. Really, the headline here is that differential hardening, or differential quenching, if you want to call it that, was something that's obviously the Japanese are really famous for, and probably the most famous in the world, but they certainly weren't the only ones doing it. We find it all over the rest of Asia, including India, Nepal, all the way down to Southeast Asia as well. We find it in China. We equally find it in Europe, used for various applications. Even if it wasn't standard and it wasn't normal, it was certainly known of, and it was certainly done for certain tools and eating utensils and things like that. So absolutely we can find it all over the world, and you know, it's not rocket science at the end of the day. If you've learnt how to quench something, well then only quenching a part of it is not that special, is not that unusual. If we really want to mark out what's unusual about the Japanese blade making process, it's the fact that they used clay to actually do this differential hardening, and the fact that they incorporate an artistic process into that to develop a hamon with a definite picture, if you want to call it that, a shape, a pattern, which could identify specific types of maker or areas of makers, or indeed some cases an actual individual or a lineage. So the hamon is special to Japan, but not necessarily the differential hardening. I hope this has been useful for some of you. Hopefully see you back on the channel again soon for another video. Cheers for watching. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.